I'm Mike.
I'm Jason.
I'm John.
This is Snake Envy. So we are joined by a very special guest today, John Roylance. Morphet Reptiles. You are on Instagram, but you and Jason tend to just kind of do business together at expos. So you guys share table space. Are there other ways people can purchase from you?
Just through Envy Reptiles.
Through Envy,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
and we work together on a lot of projects.
Yeah.
And we do a lot of business adventures.
On Morph Market, if you go to Envy, you'll probably see some of John's stuff. But you focus more on hognose snakes. You get into boas. Tell everybody a little bit about the totality of what you work with.
Yeah, you basically just said it. So if you're on Morph Market, you see hognose up there. Those are going to be animals that I am caring for, breeding, marketing. So I'll be the one that you'll deal with, even though it's to the same account. Like I'm the one that's going to be boxing them up and shipping them, and you'll be corresponding with me.
You have your own facilities separate from this.
Correct.
So
same with boas. I'm working with the Central American imperators, trying to get as much of those genes as I can and produce some pretty cool stuff. Also, I'm very interested in tree pythons. I haven't started building that collection yet, but it will be in the future. So just a few different projects, and then I'll. I'm also into the Pitchophis, and I'll be helping Jason supplement the pit production for sure.
But John's definitely got some stuff outside of the colubrid world if you're interested. But go to Instagram. I'll put it on the screen, but look for Morphet Reptiles. You'll get a better picture of some of the stuff John's working on. So for me as a hobbyist, I always have access to Jason. We do a lot of videos about genetics and breeding. Now we got two experts, so we're going to dive in. First question I have for you guys. So today we're going to talk about phenotypes. Now the difference between a phenotype and something that might be het or some other genetic trait, they're always visual. Now, in simplest terms, the color of my hair is a phenotype. It's probably genetic, but not necessarily, and it's in combination with who I marry, and then we have kids. I mean, you end up with a lot of variables. So when you guys are breeding, and it comes to a cool phenotype, and phenotype can affect pattern, it can affect color. How do the phenotypes, number one, excite you beyond the known genetics, and how often are they complete surprises? And number two, how do they affect your decisions when breeding, and are they ever a priority over the genetics? We'll start with John.
So a phenotype, the definition is just an observable trait.
Yep.
So any trait out there is a phenotype, even a wild type, a wild example. Albino, axanthic, melanistic, pied, any mutation that you're familiar with, that is a phenotype. But then there are also very subtle phenotypes. Some you can't even identify with your eye until you add them to something else or stack them on top of one another.
So sometimes you breed not really noticing maybe some of the subtle characteristics, and then when the babies come, you're like, I got to go look at those parents again.
Right, and then if you mix that with something else, it may create something never before seen, something completely new. And I first stumbled onto this back in the early 2000s with the Western hognose, and I discovered that anything that was yellow was an enhancer gene. So it didn't matter how yellow they were, and I'm not talking like a lemon ghost or anything. I'm talking about just a yellow tinted snake. I would breed it to a nice orange hognose and produce screaming reds. I would produce it to, or I'd breed it to an anaconda face hognose, and it would produce anything from the most perfectly dotted patterned original looking anacondas that they were named after that Brent Bumgardner produced, they had that anaconda look to them. Perfect examples of that, to almost superconda looking with like 90% of their pattern removed, but it was a single copy, and that was all to do with that injection of that whatever causes that yellow coloration in that normal hognose was enhancing the gene of the anaconda something like dramatically.
Now, what were you expecting when you bred the yellow to the others? Were you thinking the yellow would carry?
I was expecting to get some anacondas and use this adult female that I had, so I just really stumbled upon it.
So that's one of those happy accidents. And then you find out that the yellow fades out, but it makes the other colors brighter.
Yeah.
How about with you?
Yeah. I've had some accidents too. Originally, the Metallica Great Basins was just supposed to be orange, orange from central Utah. Took an animal with subtle orange, and then a few generations were getting bright orange, and then we had some surprises in that project where I don't even know if it's a true anery, but that's what gives it that metallic look, is when that thing pops in on the red, which doesn't make sense because anutheristic should wipe out red or orange, and it doesn't. So
that's the thing with snakes, though, and Jason and I have talked about this a lot. There are so many things going on genetically with snakes that I'm surprised science in general hasn't focused on reptiles, because there's so much to learn and there's so many paradoxes, and they're just and I think it's just because they've had so long to incorporate these genes within the species. They've been on Earth for so long, whereas like old world stuff. Jason was asking me, why do pythons have so many more genetic
and they're complex anomalies. Genetics too.
And the best I can come up with is, well, they've been around longer.
They've been around longer.
New World stuff literally hasn't been here long enough for those genes to be concentrated and all this whacked out stuff to start popping out.
Now, how often? So we've just entered breeding season. You're already having locks and you're already looking forward to things. You've already mapped out some of your breeding plan for this year. Where do phenotypes rate in terms of, compared to the known genetic traits that you can go get? How frequently are you diving into the phenotype more than kind of what's known genetically? A lot
lately.
Is it almost more fun in some ways?
It is,
because you get more surprises.
Yes, and you in bull snakes in general, all these morphs, the single gene morphs, and you got the reds and yellows that are a line bred trait, a phenotype, a subtle one. It's genetic, but it's not recessive. It's more of a line bred trait. So what I've been doing the last few years, and I'm going to do it again with another color, is adding darks, kankakee animals into yellows and reds, and this is going to change the looks of a lot of snakes down the road. Wait down the road when you see a kankakee bred to a red. It's going to take a few generations, but in about 5-6 years, maybe 7, you might see some really, really black and red snakes.
Well, we talked about your bumblebee in the last couple of weeks,
and that's one of them.
I have a kankakee at home who's a locality animal, and one of the things we were talking about is that mine, he's got good contrast, but it's more brown and gold. You're shooting for, even in his darkest places, if you look real close, it's dark brown. It's not necessarily black. He's got black stripes on his tail. He's got a black head. He's got that traditional kind of tricolor look. But throughout his body, even the saddles that might look black, when you look close, they're dark brown. Your bumblebees, it is black.
And that's not the finished product yet.
Exactly. And you're excited for these babies because they're going to be even better than the parents. They're going to be even darker. So I love the contrast on my Kankakee, and I'm a huge fan of contrast. And so it gets me excited when you're talking about contrast, because that's one of my favorite things in the snake world is when you have really good contrast between those base colors. So what's a project you're excited about this year along those same lines?
Well, with the hognose, it's definitely the Arctic trait, and a lot of the different pairings that I'm using Arctic as the enhancer gene. I'm really excited to see what Arctic axanthics can be produced. There aren't a lot of examples of them out there. Arctic is one of those traits that is like super subtle. In some cases, there could be Arctics that you can't even identify between a normal wild type animal, and then there are obvious Arctics, and then you stack the two on top and get a homozygous version of it, and it's just crazy. I mean, the colors, the pattern gets altered, the in the throat, the melanin's actually just removed to where they're translucent scales. Their eyes turn almost just solid jet black to where you can't differentiate the pupil from the iris. I mean, so taking this trait that in some individuals can be so subtle and you can't even hardly tell it apart from a normal, and have it become something that extreme when bred together is like what we're talking about. And so I'm plugging that into quite a few things this year, and I'm just really excited to see what can pop out.
And we'll put some photos up, but describe Arctic in general relative to the wild type.
It's typically just a little bit, so a single copy Arctic, which would have been the original that was produced or found in the wild, it's just kind of muted. The colors aren't as vivid and dark, and it has maybe some highlighting around the pattern. But typically they're a more muted example. Like an albino Arctic, you don't have bright red, flashy albino Arctics, because the Arctic itself takes that flashiness away and just mutes them. But then the super Arctic albino, the Sub-Zero, it's totally different. It's like coral pink and solid red eyes, and makes a huge difference.
Arctic almost gives you a matte finish.
Yeah, there's some
not the glass.
Yeah.
All right, so we've focused quite a bit on color. What about pattern? How often are you aiming for a pattern variation versus color? Or is color most of what you're trying to achieve, or do you get into patterns at all?
I think color's easier. Pattern mutations typically in a wild type animal are more than likely going to be caused from temperature variations during incubation, and that's not going to be inheritable.
Interesting.
So patterns are rough. But there are some, like the San Diego gopher. They have a couple different phenotypes. You got your blotched and you got your striped, and you mix them together and you get different.
Someone posted one last week on Facebook where it just it was striped. It would clearly have the stripe in it, but it had blotching. But the sides were wiped out.
Yeah, the sides were.
Did you see that one?
I think
That's
I saw.
cool.
I think I saw that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was actually a debate online about whether it was a stripe or not.
Yeah.
And because
I could see some striping in there.
There was definitely striping, but like you're saying, it was muted. And so there was a lot of debate about whether it really was. Now, you have a couple things going on that I want to ask you about pattern-wise. You have that paradox snake. What's the chance you think that you'll be able to replicate that? Or is that just completely, a 1 in a million thing?
I have a feeling it's one in a million, but we're going to try it.
Yeah.
We kept back a sibling, a pair, together.
And we have had Clint from Clint's Reptiles on the channel, and he's a PhD, and we've talked about that snake at length. And he was telling us that it may have been twins.
They got absorbed.
A twin got absorbed, and that maybe some albino, maybe one of the twins was albino, and that's what's left. visibly of the albino. I'm pretty sure he said it might be albino.
Yeah.
But
that's a theory.
And you end up with just a dot. And so that's amazing when you think about that. Adds a completely different layer, and that would lead you to think you can't replicate it because you'd have to have twins again. But it's interesting to speculate.
But you have to try.
You have to try.
You have to try. Like everybody, I'm like talking to a bunch of people about it, and they said, well, they're never. But every species is different in little subtle ways, and you never know. You try it and see what happens. I'm not super confident in it, but I'm going to give it a whirl.
I don't blame you. Now, you have two pine snakes I find interesting. You have a Kentucky pine, and we'll show you some of these snakes at the end, where on his saddles, it's almost like he has two headlights.
Like little windows.
He's got eyes, two dots on some of his saddles, and they're red.
There is some red in there.
And he's still young. I'm assuming the colors were going to get more intense. But you're talking about a little flash of color that wouldn't normally be there, but you're also talking about a pattern variation. It'll be interesting to see what you could do with him.
Yeah. And northern pines do go through a color change. They go through several color changes until they get to adulthood.
Yeah.
They could start out black and white, turn drab, and then come back to black and white. Or there's just so many. And I don't have a ton of experience with them, so.
But he's interesting because theoretically you could replicate both a pattern and a color, depending on what color.
They could just be tied together, and something like that.
Yeah.
I think that would be more realistic to replicate that than if, for example, it had just a solid stripe down its back. Just out of my experience.
Interesting.
Again, hognose snakes. You've got the saddled. Like perfect rattlesnake mimic, a block down its back, but then you have the twin spots. And you can get both in the same clutch, and so that is an observable trait, the spotting, and it's you can replicate it. But you can't really do it you can't bet the bank on it. You can't breed two together and get 100% like that. And so it's random.
Yeah, you also have a Janai. The Janai is one of my favorite in all of the pit world, and Northern Mexican pine. I've got one at home, and what's interesting is mine. The saddles are a very traditional shape, and they're obviously saddles. You've got some Janai where it's almost a diamond, and
there's some weird aberrancies going on in that bloodline. I've seen whacked out. People's have some that bloodline, and there's some really whacked out ones out there.
So is that something you've already proven? Is that something you're still interested in seeing how it turns out?
I'm not.
You're not?
In particular.
Okay.
I kind of just like the classic. Like I can't head up everything. Someone's going to... Just kidding. But no, I'd rather... Yeah, I'm not really trying to go that routine yet.
What's the most amazing accident you've had?
Probably those anaconda hogs.
The anacondas?
Mm-hmm. Other than just hitting good odds, I bred a pair of het leucistic Texas rats, het to het, and out of 12 eggs, I got 11 leucistics.
Oh, man.
So,
jackpot.
That's just hitting odds,
Yeah. How about you?
Probably the Metallica Great Basin, because I was just trying to make oranges. And
so that was purely an accident?
The anery part of it.
The anery part.
Or whatever that...
That one, we were talking about that, and I don't know if the camera will be able to pick it up and show it, but there's something going on there, and I think it's increasing the iridescence, the iridophores. Because you got a pit that isn't an iridescent snake in the first place, it's still going to have those iridophores, right?
Right.
And for some reason, this mutation that's tied to the orange coloration is just blowing it out of control. And they look like they have a chrome plating on them.
Wow. Yeah, we're definitely going to show you a couple of examples of that.
And we'll show you the normal ones too.
Yeah, for comparison. And it's interesting you mentioned iridescence. People don't think of pit necessarily when you say iridescence, but a lot of them have it. And particularly when you're out in the sunlight. I take my kank out in the sun, he flashes all over the place.
See, one thing being a killed scaled snake might cut back on the refraction and the reflection, so you don't pick it up quite as much. But
makes sense.
They all have it.
Yeah, they do.
But the Metallicas have it.
Yeah.
Like,
they sparkle.
Yeah.
They glow. What haven't we touched on that you want people to know about when it comes to these phenotypes and these visual traits?
I mean, sometimes you just see, like, I always look. When you say you want to work on some of these projects, and it's more or less just line breeding, really, when it comes down to. But you see subtleties in animals. I always pick, not always, but like a lot of times I'll pick the best or oddballs and just see
where it leads.
Yeah.
And just breed them. I mean, if you take this bloodline and you keep just breeding those together and producing babies out of that lineage, you may zero in on something that's floating around in there and you'll get the pairings right, but it's never going to go beyond that lineage. If you outcrossing, I mean, it strengthens the bloodline, it gives you more opportunity to find a little buried treasure, to hone in on something that doesn't exist, and in captivity at least, or combos that don't exist at all. But yeah, outcrossing, and when it's done legally and ethically, injecting wild caught blood into your captive born stuff, I think is a fantastic thing to do.
Well, and it's great for maybe possibly creating something new, but you got to strengthen these bloodlines. You can't line breed forever. And working with color morphs, you tend to, line breed a lot. But I love to outcross. I like it. I see healthier animals. So to me, that's the biggest thing about outcrossing.
Yeah, without a doubt.
But you can always find that buried treasure, like you're saying.
Yep.
Now, there's a fine line, as we discussed earlier, between morph, phenotype, genetic. I mean, in a way, a phenotype is all of the above because you can see it. But how often does what seems like an accident or seems like just a visual trait, how often, once you get into it, does it turn out that you've discovered something,
I'd say,
that's completely repeatable and truly is a genetic trait?
Not very often.
Not very often.
No.
Interesting.
It's like the paradoxing. There is that theory that it is an absorbed twin, but there are plenty of genetic snakes that are paradox.
Yeah.
The albino samboas, the toffee belly, western hognose. There are plenty that are. So is it just random and it's not inheritable on some and it is on the others? Is it I don't know. There's just...
And it probably varies somewhat by species. I mean, technically, pied is sort of a paradox type trait, but in pythons, it's absolutely inheritable and genetic.
Right.
And
then
bald
eagles, it's 100%.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a type of paradox. And I've seen a variety of pythons that have very little pied. They have one little spot. I've seen others where it's, half and half. So, well, perfect. Well, I appreciate you guys. And we always take advantage. The more experts we have and we can dive a little deeper into these topics. Let us know in the comments anything else you'd like us to talk about genetically. Tell us about your own experiences with visual traits and phenotypes. And always tell us, what breeding projects are you excited about this year? Like and subscribe, and please comment. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This is the Kentucky pine. And back here is where we talk about the little... Well, it's pretty much up and down the body.
It's almost like a pair of eyes, or it reminds me of insects that mimic bigger animals, like
a butterfly wing.
You know, yeah, like a butterfly wing, so the predator can't tell where the head is.
So that saddle, that's more wild type, that solid black.
Well, and this is a sibling. This is a sibling to it. And a poop. But she doesn't have it, like, nearly.
She's got a single one there.
She's got one.
So yeah, just based off of my experience and looking at those, I'd say you'll repeat that.
And this pair is going to go back together. These are the Metallica Great Basins. Now this first one I'm going to show you has the aneuphoristic gene, whatever's going on here. And then we'll show you some without it, and you can see the color differences. We'll first start out with this little beauty right here. And I'm sure this camera's not picking up the true. This thing's vibrant.
Yeah, the orange color is tough on the camera, but it is, just trust me that it is a deeper and brighter orange that you're seeing. But even in these fluorescent lights, you see the iridescence.
Yeah.
And then this one has it too. It's not as intense. This is, I would call a Metallica as well.
This one's not quite as bright. The color, I think, is more accurate on the camera on that one.
These ones are in the blue, unfortunately, but this one isn't as nearly. But this one doesn't have that aneuphoristic looking gene, but it has these nice pink and orange, and they do get better with age. But this is a very subtle orange. The locality gives it this busy pattern. They're busy down there. Here's another one in the blue.
In the blue, so.
And then I have a very normal. I mean, it's orange, but it's very normal looking. But that's the same lineage.
You definitely still have the orange, but the browns are much more pronounced.
And the black. It's not as black, and it's not, that sheen isn't as intense.
Yeah, the iridescence isn't coming through at all. Interesting.
This is one of those animals that I picked out. There's the only one in the clutch that looked like this. This is an orange gopher with a green tint. I don't know if it's going to pick up on camera, but in person, it's green.
Yeah, and now that's what you look for. Some oddball like that, and who knows what, down the line, that animal is going to be responsible for producing. If I were to find this out in the wild, I wouldn't sleep for a few days afterwards. I'd be so excited about finding something so crazy.
And this is still a very young snake.
Yeah.
I mean, we still don't know.
It's going to change.
To what degree that green's going to intensify.
I think it's going to go more. I think it's going to go yellow.
Really?
But it's almost a toxic yellow. It's almost like it has an inner glow.
Well, it's different than its siblings because, well, I'll show you.
So these are siblings.
Let's get in the light. But see that color difference?
Yeah, it's very dramatic when they're side by side.
I mean, you probably wouldn't think it just looking at, but side by side.
Is that yellow toxic looking one a hypo? Because by definition, that would be a hypo. It has reduced melanin. They don't have black borders. Neither one of them do. But that green one is lacking melanin.
It absolutely meets the definition.
So maybe he's onto a new strain and desperately needed strain.
So this is another example of a phenotype, It's not a recessive trait. It's just line bred. From what I understand, a normal wild-caught Great Basin, a friend kept it, laid its eggs, let her go. When the eggs hatched, 3 came out blonde. This is the feline blonde Great Basin gophers. And that is not a normal... That's not normal colors from the wild, typically.
And there's that yellow.
These are together hoping to breed.
Sorry, they're trying to jump, so I'm...
And I can tell you from a wild-caught example of a Great Basin I have at home, these are dramatically lighter. Particularly here in Utah, they tend to run fairly dark. Now, where were these from?
Feline, California.
California.
So it's a high desert. One thing to know about Great Basins too, look how clean those patterns are. The further north you go, the darker, the tipping, I call it dirty, but...
Well, I've complained to you many times that as much as I love my wild-caught Great Basin and think she's beautiful, her contrast annoys me because there's very little of it. She just ranges darker.
Yeah.
But here in Utah, that's actually pretty common.
That's very common.
And when you say dirty, she has very distinct saddles, but they're definitely not as clearly defined.
That tipping in each scale.
Yes.
And the further you go north, the worse it gets. Like Idaho animals,
yeah, Idaho,
very dark.
Exactly. Yep.
But you're always going to find a diamond in the rough, any locality of these.
Exactly.
So here we got an aberrant Jani. This isn't genetic, like recessive wise, but it is genetic. But you got to breed 2 like animals, related animals, to get this weird aberrancies.
And you had another couple of examples that have sold that we mentioned in the video where those saddles up toward the head were almost kind of diamond shaped and they had interesting pattern, but here it's all over the place.
Yep.
Stripes, patternless in some spots.
Aztec, I don't know.
Yeah. So theoretically, you could hit on any one of these aberrancies and you could end up with like striped Jani, for example.
Oh, yeah. There's more extreme than this. I've seen them out there. People have them already.